covert DNA collection, human genetic modification, biohacking, gene editing, bioweaponry. It's all going on around us every day, but most of us know nothing about this shadowy world of genetics. From myself, Mark L. Watson, this is Double Helix. First of December 2019. It was a Sunday. The first known case of coronavirus is detected in Wuhan, the biggest city in central China and the 9th biggest in the whole country. It has a population of around 11 million people. The identity of patient zero is still a mystery and should perhaps remain that way. Rumours and theories abound as to where the disease came from. From the seafood market, from infected bats, leaked from a lab. We don't know, and likely never will, despite how certain some claim to be on the origins of one of the most destructive viruses to have ever taken a world tour. By the following week, cases 2, 3 and 4 are presented. We know they hadn't been anywhere near the seafood market this time. The next day, it's cases 5 and 6. Then 7, 8, 9. You get the picture. By Christmas, the first patients were hospitalized, and staff in the respiratory wards began to don the now infamous face masks. With only hours to go, before the bell chimed in the new year, an international notification went out, warning of the potential threat and the possibility for international transmission. The Washington Post are amongst the first to pick up the story. On March the 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declares the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. Travel bans come into effect. Airports are closed, businesses fold into themselves, and the world goes into lockdown. It's a memory a little too fresh still for most of us, a little raw. We all remember the fear, the uncertainty, the boredom. As the weeks rolled by, the push from nations around the world for testing, tracing, tracking, and the incredible global vaccine effort went into full throttle. The lives of the people of Earth were at stake. Yet, as the nations of the world tried to build the infrastructure and equipment necessary to progress its testing, there remains scope for the nefarious to still pursue their own agendas. It's in desperation that weakness is revealed, and the opportunity for a predator can show itself. The global community was largely, and there are certainly exceptions, trying to band together as one to aid those not able to develop equipment and eventually vaccines by themselves. The wealthier nations were supporting those who needed it, and a global camaraderie was beginning to show. Testing equipment and the composite parts necessary to make it were flying in from around the world. Eventually, as the vaccines began to pass trials, they were the results of international relationships and a global scientific collaboration. Companies were offering assistance to other nations other than their own, and it was common for the contracts to be tendered out to foreign manufacturers. In the midst of all this, as companies bid for the contracts on foreign soil, it began to look as though one was bidding just a little harder than the rest. Bids were coming in from various companies, scattered around the country and then beyond. Though there was one that came up over and over, insistent on getting their research kit into American labs. It was a name the US authorities were already very familiar with, and one they were strongly advised to disregard. BGI. The Beijing Genomics Institute, you may remember from the previous episode, the so-called independent company who are actually the genetics arm of the Chinese Communist Party. The contracts were actually being bid for by Complete Genomics, or CGI, who operate under MGI, who are part of the BGI group. Too many acronyms, I know. I'm not surprised if you're confused. Ultimately, though, it was the Chinese who were trying to get their coronavirus testing capabilities into the US. After all, it had worked in many other countries. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had both purchased huge amounts of tech from BGI for COVID testing, and even in some US states there were a small scattering of BGI manufactured equipment. But the advisors were strongly against letting BGI run the testing facilities. Why? Well, BGI were proposing to export a rapid testing model that they claim had been immensely successful in China, so why not allow their expansive knowledge of genomics into the US protocol? Well, there were serious concerns that BGI would have access to the testing data and would, therefore, be able to do what they wish with it, though, of course, only within China where no one else could intercept it. BGI said these safety concerns were not valid, quote, and that there were no evidence to support the claims. They didn't release a formal statement, but a senior member of staff from BGI's US subsidiary offices, who looks after their commercial partnerships, publicly stated that the, quote, testing model deployed in the US would make it impossible for us to have access to patient data. But the concerns continue, and advisors are warning against the long-term ramifications of using BGI manufactured equipment. By the end of the pandemic, or at least in those first 2 years of mass outbreak, BGI successfully set up labs in 18 different countries, though, as far as anyone knows, each state in the US, along with most of the nations in the Western Europe and the Commonwealth, turned them down. I've been speaking with James Clapper, the former Director of National Intelligence for the US government. He's held several positions within the intelligence community, no less as Director of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's an authority on US intelligence and US national security, and we spoke at some lengths about the threats that China poses to the US and to its allies.
Jim Clapper served in the U.S. government for over 50 years, the last 6.5 of which was as the Director of National Intelligence for the United States. And prior to that, I served for 3.5 years as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And prior to that, I served as a director of 2 of our major intelligence agencies. My last job on active duty in the Air Force was Director of Defense Intelligence Agency for 4 years. I was out of the government for 6 years and then came back and served as Director of what's now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency for about 5 years.
I asked him if he truly thought that China was as big a threat to the US and its allies as we sometimes make out.
China's, since the formation of the People's Republic has always been an adversary. The relationship has blown hot and cold over that period of 40 or 50 years, and lately it's gotten very competitive. The Chinese have embarked on I should back up and say I consider China the U.S.'s greatest long-term threat, clearly, because of the multidimensional challenge it poses economically and militarily, particularly.
But attempts to build testing labs on foreign soil is far from the only and far from the first attempt that the Chinese government have made to get access to scientific data from within overseas labs. There are many underhand methods currently employed, and I'll go into them in a moment. But it's worth noting that one of the most effective ways of gaining access to scientific data is to own the scientist. As abstract as that idea perhaps sounds, it's one of the leading approaches taken by China under what is known as the 1,000 Talents Program. In China, it has a rather more convoluted name, translated to the Overseas High-Level Talent Recruitment Program. Its Chinese name leaves little to the imagination, and I'm sure you can imagine what it does. Put into operation in around 2007, its sole aim is to identify and recruit the best minds, the most accomplished experts in various and many fields of science, mathematics, and technology from abroad. That's the mission statement from the Chinese government who run the program, but the US, UK, Australia, and Canada have all raised serious, significant, and ongoing security concerns. That again, about the program being a method of stealing intellectual property and even as a vehicle for international espionage. So a little about the history and the overall approaches of the 1,000 Talents program. The Chinese government identified a trend amongst the brightest young minds in Chinese schools and colleges. The students would finish their studies, get their qualifications, and then often travel abroad to work. It became increasingly apparent that the students would often not return to their home country and would instead set up a new life overseas and continue putting the investment that the Chinese school system had invested into their minds into foreign business, foreign scientific endeavors, foreign research. An effort was made to try to reverse the trend. Not only would the Chinese government make more effort to convince their own students who'd gone overseas to work to return to the country, but there would also be a new program to try to bring people born overseas into China. It's worth pointing out here that under a communist state, there's very little freedom around intellectual property rights. What research and findings come from any independent facility are largely the property of the state. And while, as Dan Prudhomme explains in his story for the Harvard Business Review, the IP laws in China are perhaps not as stringent as some investors may think, they certainly leave a lot to be desired. China respects copyright and patent laws, much the same as most nations. But there's not a great deal of defense against the big dogs swooping in to claim your scientific research findings as their own or taking away your ability to practice and work as a matter of national security. So in 2010, the CCP Central Committee, along with the State Council, brought into effect the 1,000 Talents program, with the aim of searching out and wrangling the best minds that they could lay their hands on. Initially, its search parameters were set to attract Chinese nationals who'd been either educated or highly trained in specialist subjects overseas and make them attractive offers to return with their brain full of important knowledge. Their knowledge base would be extracted from them willingly or by coercion. Like I've said, you don't argue. China's insistence on becoming the world's elite superpower knows no bounds, it should be said. The individuals should, at least when the program first started, need to be internationally renowned, top professors in their field, prize winners, company bosses, the very best of the best. 1,000 of the best minds, replacing those lost to overseas business and international research, boosting the Chinese competitiveness internationally. But they didn't stop when they reached 1,000. Within the first decade of its inception, they'd gathered more than 7,000 members onto the program, and the number's grown significantly since then. It goes some way to explaining that since it started, the number of new international patents granted to the US has flickered between 45,000 and 55,000, while those granted to China has risen from around 12,000 to nearly 60,000. 2000. Those who agree to become a part of the program are rewarded with high pay packages, visa benefits including long-term and work visa entries, and the rather fancy title of Distinguished Professor. Furthermore, and rather crucially, especially when viewed through the lens of the topics being discussed in this podcast, it allows scientists and researchers of many disciplines and fields to conduct their research within the constraints of Chinese law, and that's important. There are significant, extensive, and tightly enforced human rights, civil rights, medical rights across most of the globe. Most countries with the wealth of scientific research facilities control them tightly, and of course they should. It isn't possible, for example, to conduct research on humans in a British research lab. The US authorities and standards are not going to allow a US pharmaceutical lab to test its products on unsuspecting children. The rules are there for all to see, and there's no way to bend them. But in China, the rules are set to be bent as freely as the authorities see fit. So providing one has the blessing of the CCP and its subsidiary bodies, scientific research is a no-holds-barred game. If the work being done, whether scientific or economic, can potentially yield results which will elevate China's position as a or the leading superpower, then you're in. And realistically, it's not a bad deal. You get the huge payoff, all the benefits, the lovely professor badge for your suit, and the permission to do whatever you want in the lab. As I said, China's obsession with being the best is bordering a little on the insane. The limits to which they are sometimes willing to grow is of growing concern to the international community, however. And thus you see why the authorities in the US were concerned that BGI COVID testing labs may not be all that they seem.
This government presents, I think, a sui generis threat to international human rights law and institutions in ways that will have profound consequences for the future.
That's Sophie Richardson, the China Director for Human Rights Watch, who we met in the previous episode. We'll be hearing a lot more from her as the series goes on.
A state that decides not just that it is okay to, but puts in place high-tech mechanisms to, surveil whether a particular individual is putting gas in a car that they don't own, or that they are going out the front door instead of the back door of their house, and that's somehow an indication of political disloyalty that requires, quote unquote, re-education.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty terrifying proposition. And you can see this baked into not just policies, but into procurement documents and into...
But it's that need for control. Why would anyone or any government or any state authority feel that they require anything like that level of control?
Yeah, I think it's not just control at this point. It's not as if as he came to power and sort of solidified his rule over the last decade, that he has faced, or that the Chinese Communist Party has faced any significant challenges to their grip on power, and watching the ways those authorities have assiduously stamped out even the tiniest pockets of peaceful criticism. We're not even talking about any sort of organized opposition or an effort to register a different political party or anything like that, but simply peaceful criticism from these tiny pockets across the country. But the transformation, the mutation maybe is the right word, to a belief that citizens' thinking needs to be reshaped.
As I'm recording this, it's 2023, but much of the research for it was done across 2022. And I was sitting one day deep in the depths of research on the internet when my phone beeped with a notification. A story had broken on the BBC News site from Gordon Carrera, the security correspondent. China technology poses major risk. GCHQ chief, reads the headline. The piece details the recent lecture from Sir Jeremy Fleming, the head of the UK's security and intelligence organisation GCHQ. They're the equivalent to the NSA in the States, or Mossad in Israel. Virtually every country in the world has some department or organisation in their government which does the same job. This is an urgent problem, said Fleming, which needs addressing now by the UK and its allies in order to curb China's attempts to secure control both at home and abroad by its increasing manipulation of tech. It's trying, in his words, to, quote, gain strategic advantage by shaping the world's technology ecosystems. It's trying to implement its own technologies in overseas nations, build up an infrastructure of Chinese-led or owned facilities or even communities in order to penetrate into the lives of everyday citizens and to extract as much information and data as it could, which would, and this is reading between the lines a little, be used against them. Fleming points to the controversies surrounding Huawei and the worrisome Chinese ownership of TikTok, both of which are harnessing your personal data for use in Chinese research and development. It makes you think those Department of Health advisors in the US made a good shout at blocking the BGI labs. More worrying, though really a conversation for another day, is the huge satellite surveillance system that the Chinese are putting into the skies. After all, nobody's in charge in space. Not only can they operate levels of incredible surveillance, but they're also capable of knocking other satellites out of the skies. Ever wonder why China isn't investing trillions into its physical military infrastructure? Why countless other nations possess far more warships and submarines and helicopters than them, even though they're a leading economy with an incredible population? Because their military spending is going into the ability to wipe out the opponent's satellite capabilities. Just think about that. Without satellite technology, our world stops, and those super-powered warships and armoured helicopters can't even find China.
They focus on what they think are our strengths, and they seek vulnerabilities. So the reason they have a very, very aggressive counter space program, which is designed to go after what they know we rely heavily on, which is space. They have an array of weapon systems designed to kill carriers, and they're probably pretty effective, and we don't have much of an antidote for them. So I think, they approach this by analyzing what they think they need to do to compensate for what we believe are our strengths, and it's actually a pretty smart approach.
But, like I said, that's a rabbit hole for another day. And so, bringing this back full circle to where we began, I hope you're starting to get the picture that China is, without apology or subterfuge, going to endless lengths to get its hands on scientific data from across the globe, all under this sole focus of becoming the best of the best of the best. Whether it's surveillance technology in the phones of your children, satellites with the ability to monitor your activities, or the focused efforts to get their hands on your genetic data, their path is relentless. China wants your data, and in the words of the NPR's national security correspondent Greg Meyer, it may already have it. Meyer writes that, quote, DNA collection by Chinese companies, even when done openly and legally, should be seen as part of a comprehensive effort to vacuum up millions and millions of records on US citizens. And he goes on to note that US officials claim that, quote, many Chinese efforts violate US law. The NPR report quotes April Falcon Doss, the former Associate General Counsel for Intelligence Law at the NSA, as saying, quote, "Most Americans have probably had their data compromised by the cyber intelligence units of the Chinese government and the Chinese military intelligence." Most Americans, her words, and by extension, many, many other citizens of the free world, namely, you. The reasons behind such a vast effort to vacuum up everyone's data are manifold. Boosting its economy, ensuring it has the lead on the new innovations and inventions, and is in a position to put its products before the world who are desperate to buy them. Advances in technology, in medicine, in pharmaceuticals, and in genetics. To create advances in espionage and international control, and also to lead the world in AI. And as April Falcon Doss says in her book Cyber Piracy, Who Has Your Data and Why You Should Care, quote, "What you need to feed artificial intelligence algorithms is lots and lots and lots of data." China has always, well, at least in recent history, been keen on showing the world that it's the best, and that its old nemesis, the US, is not.
Historically, their major effort has been on gathering information, extracting, stealing intellectual property. And they're quite brazen about it because they actually plan what they want. They know what their strengths are, their indigenous technological capabilities, and where it's not what they think it should be, then they'll steal it from other people, to include us. And they've been very aggressive about that. They're also concerned about, to the extent that they can intimidate Chinese people or people of Chinese descent in our country and in other countries. Australia comes to mind as another case in point. But all of this is, I think, predicated on a huge feeling of insecurity, and the way they try to compensate for that is control their own population and to gain as much information about competitors like us as they possibly can. But I think it's all a function of their insecurity.
In the past few years, the USA has blamed China for a huge number of data breaches into US information. It accuses China of the theft of 145 million records from credit agency Equifax, another 400 million from hotel chain Marriott, 78 million from a health insurer, another 20-odd million directly from the government, and the list goes on and on and on. And whilst this is not a case of picking sides, it's impossible to see how the US aren't largely correct with their allegations. Beijing deny theft. They deny hacking. It's more American propaganda aimed at knocking back Chinese progress, they say. But it's not difficult to see the bigger picture here, and to see what larger game the Chinese authorities are playing with the likes of you and me. Each cyber hack, each data theft, each time they manage to coerce or convince or trick a piece of genetic data into their possession, another tiny piece of the overall puzzle they own.
I can't imagine, from a practical sense, what in the world they're going to do with all that data. I was in office as a director of national intelligence when they hacked the Office of Personnel Management and stole extensive background investigatory kind of data on people with clearances in the United States. Now, we never, to my knowledge, never saw any example of they're actually using the data they purloined. And it makes you wonder, the mere act of stealing it apparently gives them a feeling of security, or the fact that they can do it.
Interesting.
But in practical terms, what on earth are they going to do with all that data?
Yeah, so you think it's not necessarily a means to an end. It's the means is.
I've often wondered about that. They steal these vast array of data, much of which has a transitory value, by the way.
Yeah.
And then what do they do with it? Manipulate it? Look at it? I don't know.
The data theft of personal information is one thing, and by itself, not of any greatly productive benefit to anyone. But combine it with the DNA and genetic data collection that we've been discussing, and you begin to see the larger profile that China can create on us, in order, as the head of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center Mike Orlando states, quote, to surveil us, to manipulate us, and to extort us. In 2015, Barack Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping signed a cyber espionage agreement, declaring that neither nation would, quote, conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of international property, including trade secrets or other confidential business information for commercial advantage. A month later, China signed a similar agreement with the UK, and since then the Chinese Ministry for Public Security and the US Department of Homeland Security have held more meetings where the issue has been discussed, with guidelines set out for both parties for requesting assistance on cybercrime. And in August of 2016, a special hotline had been set up between the DHS in Washington and the MPS in Beijing. Though, as Adam Siegel writes for the Council on Foreign Relations, quote, Beijing and Washington do not have shared interests in cybersecurity, and that strategic mistrust is high between the two sides, and they remain divided over many other digital issues, including the free flow of information, internet governance, data localization, and how best to secure information. With the current levels of cyber espionage and data theft being employed by the CCP and its affiliates, any chance of the agreement being honoured in an honest and respectful manner is some significant distance away. But the relationship between the Chinese and American worlds of genetics and genomics is not an entirely empty and fruitless one. There are long-standing agreements in place between the US and Chinese companies which have served to aid the CCP's attempts at genetic surveillance, at harvesting and processing human DNA data, and furthering the research that the likes of BGI are currently doing. And it goes some way back. Formed from a merger in 2006, Thermo Fisher Scientific has rapidly grown into a Fortune 500 company with a turnover of nearly $40 billion. They're one of the leading suppliers of scientific instrumentation and software across the biotech, healthcare, and pharmaceutical sectors, and are run from their headquarters in Waltham, Massachusetts, a huge 6-story glass building, proudly flying the stars and stripes, and often with it, the rainbow flag of the LGBTQ community. A proud American company with the best interests of its own people at its very core, providing the best equipment it can for furthering scientific research and knowledge, and the receiver of an FDA-approved emergency use authorization for its work on COVID-19 testing in the depths of the pandemic.
Means being able to see, making progress,
moving ahead with conviction,
being a change agent, balance, doing the right thing.
June 26th, 2013, Thermo Fisher Scientific announced they're making a landmark stride forward in expanding their research and development in the Asia-Pacific region, and they're opening a new China Innovation Center in Shanghai. President and CEO Mark Casper said China is, quote, one of our fastest growing markets and continues to be a key contributor to our success. 30,000 square feet of laboratories and an additional 10,000 square feet of training facilities. The building was the latest staple in Thermo Fisher's Chinese portfolio, which at the time it opened nearly 10 years ago already employed 2,500 people in mainland China and Hong Kong. Their place in the market grew. Their R&D capabilities grew, and they became a key supplier of equipment and software to various scientific institutes and organizations across China, and indeed the rest of the world. Thermo Fisher became, in their fairly young lifespan of the business, one of the world's leaders in the supply and implementation of their kit. Labs across the planet were, indeed still are, using thermo-branded equipment to great use in various fields of biology and pharmaceuticals. Then in early 2019, news leaks out that it's Thermo Fisher's equipment, which BGI and the Chinese authorities have been using in the genetic surveillance they've been employing against their own people, with particular focus on the persecuted Uyghur Muslim population. As I said earlier, news of the genocide had emerged a couple of years earlier than that, though it was in 2021 before it was labelled as such. The relevant authorities were aware, though. They were aware, at least in part, that China was undertaking an extensive program of DNA collection and cataloguing, and of genetic surveillance. Even though it was perhaps only known to be doing it against its own people at that point. Of course, the picture unfolds more and more each day, even up to the date of this recording. Thermo Fisher were put in, as you would expect, a difficult position. They were faced with the allegations of, even unwittingly, aiding in the persecution of the Uyghurs and allowing, through the use of their equipment and software, the genocide, the oppression, the human rights breaches of millions. The American company came out in February of that year, 2019, and publicly announced that they would no longer sell or service the incriminating gene sequencers to the Chinese, and they cited their, quote, values, ethics codes and policies, according to the breaking story in the Wall Street Journal. A Thermo Fisher spokesperson went on record as stating that the company must recognize the importance in considering how their products and services are used or may be used by customers. So, that would be that. The Thermo Fisher story here becomes a side story at best, a margin note against the larger picture of genetic surveillance, of DNA harvesting, and the much, much darker things to follow, about which I'm yet to tell you in this podcast. And trust me, it couldn't get much darker. But that isn't the end of this side story. You see, China makes up about 10% of Thermo Fisher's business revenue, about $20 billion annually. Quote, our greatest success story in emerging markets, is said in a report, continues to be China. And so making the dog drop the stick wasn't as simple as clicking one's fingers. It ended up becoming a lot bigger of a deal, and one that by many accounts is still ongoing. Republican Senator Mark Rubio went on record deploring Thermo Fisher's continued support of China, saying it was, quote, grotesque to read that Thermo Fisher was still fawning over Xi Jinping, and that they were making billions helping the Xinjiang authorities conduct mass detention and brutal suppression by selling them its DNA sequencers. Sophie Richardson, who we've heard from a couple of times now, said that the move to stop selling equipment to the Chinese was, quote, an important step, and that other companies should assess their sales and operations in the country too, and in particular in the Xinjiang region. But more than a year later, as the dust had settled, it all got kicked up once more. An independent report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute came into the light and turned the eyes back onto China and on to Thermo Fisher. It was called Genomic Surveillance, Inside China's DNA Dragnet. It tells largely the same story that I've been telling you thus far, but noted that Thermo Fisher were indeed still selling and servicing equipment in China. It alleged that they still had business dealings with the Ministry of Public Security, the overarching police bureaucracy in China. In October of 2019, the Trump administration, in line with the president's quite public dislike and disdain for China, added 28 Chinese organizations onto an existing blacklist, which prohibited the sale of US technology to most Chinese law enforcement agencies, except under certain mitigating exceptions, citing concerns about their role in human rights violations and effectively blocking them from buying American products. It included companies and entities who specialize in everything from artificial intelligence to voice recognition. Reception to the ban was mixed. As the New York Times reported on the day, quote, in many cases the Chinese could find ways to replace the American components and have likely already stockpiled key parts, but that in the longer term, it could hamper their access to US and European markets. Either way, the Chinese were not likely to be happy at the ruling. And that was in late 2019. Washington warned that companies selling biometric technology and other products to Xinjiang should be very aware of the, quote, reputational, economic, and legal risks of doing so. But midway through last year, with its great investigative journalists doing some quiet digging and probing, the New York Times managed to get its hands on some Chinese government procurement documents and some existing contracts, showing that there were still extensive sales of the banned technology made between the Chinese authorities and Thermo Fisher, alongside another US biotech manufacturer, Promega, a Wisconsin-based company with a revenue of nearly $500 million. The US equipment, despite the bans, despite the warnings of legal ramifications, and despite the global condemnation, was still flowing into China and, most crucially, into Xinjiang, where it was being used to process the DNA stolen from millions of citizens and forms an important part of the illegalities taking place there.
After Human Rights Watch and a number of members of Congress and ultimately the New York Times had written about and publicized Thermo Fisher having sold DNA sequencers to the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, the company said publicly that it would no longer sell that particular technology to those particular authorities. But there was subsequent work done by the New York Times showing that Thermo Fisher equipment was still being found in geographic areas where human rights violations were ongoing. And I believe you will absolutely want to double check this, that the company said at the time that that equipment had been on-sold from one local authority to another. So meaning that they didn't have, I believe what they said was that they did not have control over those sales. And I believe that they said that they had clauses in their sales contracts that forbade that kind of on sale. Raises all sorts of questions about how much control over they have over that, and whether, having found that second problem, they really should continue to sell that technology at all.
I did go on to double check this, and Sophie Richardson is, of course, completely correct. The Chinese authorities, especially in Xinjiang, do have their loopholes. They know how to circumvent some of the contractual obligations set out by Thermo Fisher. And whilst the Chinese, of course, say that the kit is being used for policing and for furthering research into diseases and immunology, its use as a surveillance tool is now fairly clear. Gulaba Hatiwaji, a Uyghur Muslim from the Xinjiang region, reported to the New York Times that her blood had been taken 5 or 6 times during her time in detention, along with scans of her face, scans of her irises, and even recordings of her voice. She says that on one random morning, so-called health officials turned up unannounced and pricked the fingers of over 250 detainees. Nobody was given any explanation as to why, or what would be happening with the blood samples. "We had no right to ask," she told the Times, from her hideaway in France to where she's now exiled herself. Stories coming out of Tibet, even as recently as October last year, claim that Thermo Fisher are still selling equipment to the Chinese authorities who are using it for the aforementioned means. The news desk at Fayul, a Tibetan news site, reported during my writing of this podcast that police authorities in Xinjiang had existing contracts for the purchase of another set of DNA profiling kit from the US company, and that, quote, the CCP last month procured DNA kits and replacement parts which would be sent to the authorities in Tibet. And so on the persecution goes. Millions of detainees stripped of their human rights, catalogued and treated as data points, less than civilians. Locked up against their will indefinitely, their civil liberties nowhere to be seen. and the regional authorities and the CCP at large, along with their assets in companies like BGI, continue to wage a data war, a tech war, a biotech war against the free world. Those inside China seem to be unable to really object to their genetic and personal data being taken. But what about those outside of the country? There are ways of getting the data from you, too. Yes, you. You see, they can hack their way to your personal data, and probably already have. But what about your DNA? What about your genome? What about the little data points that exist inside each of us that make us exactly who we are, that thing that makes us unique, the little blocks of exactly what makes you, you? Well, there are ways of China getting that, too. How they do it, and exactly what horrific things have come of it, is for next time.
Double Helix was written and produced by myself, Mark Watson. Sound design is produced with credit to Looperman and Pixabay. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the show, and to all my guests who kindly gave up time from their busy schedules to speak with us. And I'd like to thank you, too, the listener. Without your support, none of this would be possible. You can find more content and follow my work at marklwatson.co.uk or by searching anywhere online. Thank you for listening, and please go and dig deeper on everything that has been discussed in this show. There is so much more yet to uncover.